The corner booth at Ashwood and Crow had remained empty for 3 years, not from lack of reservations, but from fear that transcended rational thought. The burgundy leather seats could accommodate 6 people comfortably, yet only one man ever occupied that space, and he sat alone by choice that everyone respected without question. Theron Cade arrived every Thursday at precisely 9:45, when the Portland establishment hit its stride between dinner service and late-night cocktails. The hostess would see his black Mercedes pull to the curb, and her hand would already be reaching for the reserved placard that lived in the podium drawer. Table 7. Always Table 7. The corner position with sightlines to both entrances, the kitchen door, and the street beyond floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Willamette River's dark water. Tonight followed the established pattern with mechanical precision. Theron entered in a charcoal suit that whispered expensive tailoring, his salt and pepper hair styled with the kind of careless perfection that suggested a man who'd stopped caring about impressing anyone decades ago. At 43, he carried himself with the economy of movement that came from knowing his presence alone commanded attention. He didn't need to gesture or raise his voice. The room simply adjusted around him. Other diners noticed his arrival through peripheral vision, awareness like prey animals developed around predators. Conversations didn't stop, but they modulated differently. Laughter became slightly more muted. The couple debating their wedding venue suddenly found consensus. The businessmen arguing over a contract discovered middle ground worth exploring. His effect on the atmosphere was gravitational, a heavy object warping the space around itself. Bryony Ashford had been watching this ritual for 6 months from her position behind the bar, where she crafted cocktails that cost more than her weekly grocery budget. She'd learned the pattern quickly during her first week. Theron arrived, occupied his booth, ordered the same Macallan neat, and conducted meetings with men who looked uncomfortable even when the conversation seemed cordial. No one lingered at table 7 beyond their allotted time. No one ever sat beside him without explicit invitation. The other servers had warned her during training. Don't approach table 7 unless he signals. Don't make small talk. Don't ask if everything's all right. Just bring what Owen prepares, place it precisely on his left, and leave. The instructions carried the weight of commandments handed down from frightened prophets who'd witnessed consequences they wouldn't describe. But tonight, Bryony had stopped caring about commandments or consequences, or the survival strategies that governed her life for the past 8 months. Tonight, she'd received the third message, the one that included photographs she didn't know existed, alongside a deadline that expired in 72 hours. Tonight, she'd exhausted every conventional option and arrived at the conclusion that desperate situations required desperate measures. She untied her bar apron with hands that wanted to shake but refused to give them permission. Her reflection in the back bar mirror showed a 29-year-old woman who'd learned to hide exhaustion behind makeup and practice smiles. The auburn hair pulled into a professional bun revealed bone structure her mother had called aristocratic before the money disappeared, and aristocracy became a joke they couldn't afford to laugh at. Owen, the head bartender, caught her movement. "Bree, where are you?" He stopped mid-sentence when he saw her direction of travel. His expression shifted through confusion, concern, and something approaching panic. "Don't. Whatever you're thinking, don't." She didn't answer. Words would require explanations she didn't have time for, and besides, talking might give her brain time to recognize the insanity of what she was about to do. Better to move before thinking, to act before the fear calcified into paralysis. The walk from bar to booth covered maybe 30 feet, but the distance felt continental. Her footsteps registered on the polished hardwood, each click of her sensible heels announcing her approach. The surrounding conversations didn't stop this time. They died completely, as if someone had flipped a switch that controlled the room's audio. Even the pianist in the corner seemed to sense something unprecedented occurring, his rendition of Autumn Leaves trailing off into confused silence. Theron had been reviewing something on his phone, the blue glow illuminating sharp features that probably softened for someone, somewhere, but never in public spaces where softness could be mistaken for weakness. He looked up as her shadow fell across his table, his dark eyes tracking her approach with assessment that missed nothing. Her accelerated pulse visible at her throat, the way her right hand clenched and released in rhythmic anxiety. The precise angle of her chin lifted in manufactured courage. "Table 7 is," he began, his voice carrying the low timbre of distant thunder. Bryony slid into the booth beside him before he could finish, her hip settling against burgundy leather that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The presumption of it, the absolute violation of unspoken protocol, resonated through the restaurant like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the ripples of shock emanating outward, heard the hostess's sharp intake of breath, and saw Owen's face go pale behind the bar. She turned to face Theron directly, close enough now to smell his cologne, something expensive and understated that suggested old money and older power. Close enough to see the flecks of amber in his dark irises, the small scar above his left eyebrow that makeup couldn't quite conceal, the way his jaw tightened incrementally with what might have been surprise or fury or both. "Everyone in this city knows two things about you," Bryony said, proud that her voice emerged steady despite the fact that her heart was attempting to escape through her ribcage. "That you're the most dangerous man in Portland, and that you honor your debts." She paused, letting the words settle between them like cards laid on a table. "I'm here to negotiate one." She met his eyes without flinching, even as every survival instinct screamed that she should look away, should apologize, and should run before whatever came next erased her from existence like a mistake being corrected. But running was no longer an option. She'd already chosen her path when she'd walked away from the bar. Theron's expression remained unreadable, that perfect mask he'd probably spent decades perfecting until it became his actual face. But something changed behind his eyes, a door opening to a room he'd locked years ago. His phone went dark in his hand. His untouched scotch sat forgotten. The entire restaurant held its breath, waiting for the universe to correct this aberration, to restore order through whatever means his displeasure required. Instead, he leaned back against the booth with movements so controlled they suggested violence being consciously restrained. His gaze never left her face, reading her the way interrogators read suspects, searching for the truth beneath the performance. "Sit beside me without invitation," he said quietly, each word precisely placed. "And you either have nothing left to lose, or you've miscalculated so badly that you will." He tilted his head slightly, a gesture that might have been curiosity on someone less dangerous. "Which is it, Miss Ashford?" The fact that he knew her name, despite her never having directly served his table, should have terrified her. Instead, it confirmed what she'd gambled on, that men like Theron Cade didn't survive by being unaware of their surroundings. He'd probably known her life story since her second shift, had likely run background checks as casually as most people checked social media. She met his eyes without fear, and for the first time in a decade, he didn't know what to do next. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut, waiting for the snap that would release whatever came next. Bryony could feel the weight of the entire restaurant's attention pressing against her back. Could sense Owen probably calling someone, management, security, possibly emergency services. No one had ever sat beside Theron Cade without permission. No one had ever survived that level of presumption with anything except apologies and rapid retreat. "Both," she answered finally, her voice cutting through the quiet with more strength than she felt. I have nothing left to lose, and I've probably miscalculated badly. But I'm here anyway, because miscalculation is still better than certainty. An expression flickered across his face too quickly to interpret. His fingers drummed once against the table, a single tap that carried more menace than most men's threats. You work here 6 months, he said, statement not question. Before that, 3 years at Mercer Street Tavern. Before that, Portland State. Graduated with honors despite working 2 jobs. Philosophy major. His mouth curved slightly at that last detail, though it couldn't be called a smile. Interesting choice for someone who clearly understands practical economics. Bryony refused to let his knowledge intimidate her, though the thoroughness of it lodged somewhere between impressive and terrifying. Philosophy teaches you that most problems are older than you are, and that people have been making desperate choices since we learned to ask questions we couldn't answer. And what's your desperate choice tonight? Theron asked, his attention absolute now. Whatever business he'd been conducting on his phone had been abandoned. Whatever meetings he'd scheduled could wait. She'd purchased his focus through sheer audacity, and the cost of that purchase remained to be calculated. She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a phone. Not her regular one, but the prepaid cell that vibrated 3 times daily with messages that turned her stomach. She placed it on the table between them with the same formality someone might present evidence in a trial. 8 months ago, I was stupid. I trusted someone I shouldn't have. I made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time and catastrophic in hindsight. Theron didn't reach for the phone. His eyes stayed on her face, reading the story beneath the words. And now that person owns something they shouldn't. Photographs, Bryony confirmed, hating the way shame crawled up her throat. Videos. Things I did when I believed I was in a private relationship, not creating insurance material for someone else's future needs. She forced herself to continue, to speak the thing that had been choking her for months. He's demanding $50,000 by Sunday, or everything goes online. My family sees it. My employer sees it. Everyone I've ever known gets a front row seat to my worst judgment. The number hung in the air between them, obscene in its impossibility. $50,000 might as well have been $50 million for someone who measured her wealth in whether she could afford both groceries and rent in the same week. You could go to the police, Theron observed, though his tone suggested he already knew why she hadn't. I did, Bryony said flatly. They explained that, technically, I consented to the recordings at the time. That revenge porn laws are complicated when there's gray area about ongoing relationships. That they'd investigate, which means nothing happens until after he's already destroyed my life. They were very sympathetic and completely useless. Theron's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. So, you come to me. Because you've heard what? That I solve problems the law can't touch? I come to you because everyone knows you own half the city, that people who cross you tend to relocate suddenly, and that you operate by different rules than the ones that protect men like him. She held his gaze with effort that cost her. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a transaction. You make him disappear. The threat, the material, all of it. And I'll work off the debt however you require. The words hung between them with implications she'd considered and accepted. When you had nothing left, you bet everything on the table, even yourself. Theron studied her with intensity that felt like being examined under microscopic precision. Do you understand what you're offering? His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. What, however I require, might mean coming from a man like me. Yes, Bryony said, though her pulse hammered against her throat. but I understand worse what it means when a man like him controls your life through fear. At least with you, it would be a negotiation. With him, it's just slow destruction. Theron's expression remained unreadable, that perfect mask revealing nothing. But his fingers had stopped their drumming. His scotch remained untouched. And he hadn't called security to remove her, which meant he was actually considering her proposal. Her next words would either save her life or end it. I need you to make someone disappear. The request settled between them like something physical, tangible enough to examine from different angles. Theron's expression betrayed nothing, but Bryony noticed his right hand had moved slightly closer to his scotch glass, not to drink, but perhaps needing something to ground him while he processed what she'd just asked. Disappear, he repeated, testing the word's weight. You understand that particular verb has different meanings in my world, some more permanent than others. I don't want him dead, Bryony clarified quickly, though part of her, the part that woke from nightmares of exposure, wasn't entirely certain that was true. I just want him gone, out of my life, unable to hurt me anymore, whatever that looks like in practical terms. Theron was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, focused on something beyond the immediate conversation. When he spoke again, his voice carried a roughness that hadn't been there before. How old were you when you trusted the wrong person? The question seemed unrelated to their negotiation, but his tone demanded honesty. 28. Old enough to know better. No one's ever old enough to know better, Theron said, more to himself than to her. They just pretend they are afterward, when hindsight makes fools of everyone. His fingers finally closed around the scotch glass, lifting it halfway before setting it back down untouched. I was 16 when I learned that trust is a weapon other people use against you, that privacy is a myth, and that the person you let see you vulnerable is the person who knows exactly where to push the knife. Bryony felt recognition pass between them, acknowledgement that they'd both been betrayed by people who were supposed to care. Different circumstances, different ages, different wounds. But the mathematics of being hurt by someone you'd trusted were universal and timeless. So you understand, she said quietly, why I can't just let this continue. Why the law's timeline doesn't work when he owns pieces of you that he can deploy whenever he wants. Theron turned to face her fully now, his shoulder angling toward her in the booth. Up close, she could see lines around his eyes that suggested he'd done more living than a single lifetime should require. What's his name? Marcus Lyle. She watched Theron's face for reaction and saw only that same controlled blankness. He manages a tech startup downtown, lives in the Pearl District, plays racquetball on Tuesdays and thinks he's untouchable because he's meticulous about keeping everything in encrypted folders that he's promised will auto-release if anything happens to him. Smart, Theron acknowledged. Cowardly, but smart. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something. Not a weapon, as her adrenaline-spiked brain had feared, but a simple white envelope, unmarked. He pushed it across the table with 2 fingers. Inside is a phone number. You'll call it tomorrow at noon. Tell them I authorized the conversation. They'll ask you questions. Answer truthfully. Location, habits, security measures, everything you know about Marcus Lyle and his insurance policy. Bryony stared at the envelope like it might contain a snake. That's it? You're just helping me? I'm doing reconnaissance, Theron corrected. There's a difference between helping and committing. But your problem interests me, and I don't like men who think encryption makes them gods. His gaze pinned her in place. But understand this. Once you make that call, once my people start moving pieces, you're in my world. You don't get to change your mind. You don't get to decide halfway through that you've made a mistake. You commit completely, or you don't start at all. The warning was clear, but so was the implicit offer underneath it. He was giving her an out, one final chance to walk away before she crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Bryony picked up the envelope, feeling its weight, so light for something that might change everything. And the debt? What do I owe you for this? Theron's expression shifted into something that almost resembled a smile, though it carried no warmth. You already paid, he said. The moment you sat down here, you bet everything you had. That courage is rare enough to be valuable. He paused, studying her with renewed intensity. But there's one more thing you need to know. The real reason I helped you. He pushed an envelope across the table. Inside was either her salvation or her death warrant. Bryony's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the envelope, the paper crisp and expensive under her touch. She glanced at Theron's face, searching for clues about what she was about to discover, but his expression remained that same constructed neutrality that revealed absolutely nothing. Inside, she found a photograph. Not recent, but old enough that the colors had begun fading at the edges. A teenage boy, maybe 15 or 16, stared back at her with eyes that hadn't yet learned to hide their fear. He wore a school uniform that looked too large for his thin frame, and his right eye carried the greenish-yellow shadow of a healing bruise. "That's me," Theron said quietly. 3 months before I stopped being someone who got hit and became someone who did the hitting. He paused, his jaw working slightly. The person who took that picture thought they were creating evidence for a custody hearing. Instead, they created leverage. Blackmail material that followed me for years, surfacing whenever someone thought they could control me through shame. Bryony looked up from the photograph, understanding dawning with uncomfortable clarity. Someone used this against you. Multiple people, Theron corrected. Until I learned that the only way to neutralize extortion is to remove either the material or the person wielding it. Sometimes both. His gaze held hers with gravity-like intensity. When you sat down here tonight, you reminded me what it feels like to be trapped by someone else's cruelty. I don't help people often, Miss Ashford. But when I do, it's because I recognize myself in their desperation. The honesty of it settled between them, more intimate than any physical contact. This wasn't just a transaction anymore. It was more complex, more human. Two people who'd been weaponized by trust, finding unexpected alliance in shared wounds. "Tomorrow at noon," Theron repeated, sliding a business card across the table. "Ask for Dahlia. She'll coordinate the details." Bryony pocketed both the envelope and the card, her mind already racing ahead to the conversation she'd have, the information she'd need to provide. "How long will this take? He's expecting an answer by Sunday." "We'll know more after reconnaissance," Theron said. "But if what you've told me is accurate, we're working against a very specific clock." He checked his phone briefly, his expression darkening slightly at whatever message he'd received. "Go home. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow begins a process that doesn't stop once it starts." She nodded and began sliding out of the booth, her legs unsteady from adrenaline crash. But Theron's voice stopped her before she could stand. "Miss Ashford." He waited until she met his eyes. "Marcus Lyle. Does he know where you live? Your daily patterns? Places you go when you're not working?" The question sent ice down her spine. "Yes. We dated for 4 months. He's been to my apartment dozens of times." "Why?" Theron's expression shifted into something darker, more predatory. "Because men who think they're untouchable often make preemptive moves when they sense resistance. You challenged his control by not immediately complying with his demands. That makes you unpredictable, and unpredictable victims sometimes become urgent problems that need immediate solutions. Bryony's breath caught. You think he might— I think you should stay somewhere else tonight, Theron interrupted. Somewhere he doesn't know about. A friend's place? A hotel? Anywhere but your apartment. He paused, then made a decision that flickered across his face. Or you can use one of my properties. Corporate housing in the West Hills. Empty, secure, and completely disconnected from your normal life. The offer was generous and terrifying in equal measure, another line being crossed. But the fear in her chest, the sudden sharp awareness that Marcus might be more dangerous than she'd calculated, made the decision easier. The corporate housing, she said. Please. Theron made a brief phone call, speaking in low tones that she couldn't quite catch. When he ended it, he handed her a key card. 1523 Skyline Terrace, 23rd floor. The code is 8842. Everything you need is already there. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Don't stop by your apartment for anything. And don't use your regular phone to communicate with anyone you normally contact. You really think he's that dangerous? I think desperation makes everyone dangerous, Theron replied. And Marcus Lyle is about to become very desperate. Bryony left through the back entrance as instructed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Portland night air bit through her thin uniform shirt, carrying the smell of river water and distant rain. Behind her, Ashwood and Crow continued its elegant evening, unaware that the woman who'd served them cocktails for 6 months had just made a deal with the most dangerous man in the city. At precisely 2:47 the next morning, Theron's phone buzzed with an alert from his security team. The message contained 3 photos. Marcus Lyle's car parked outside Bryony's apartment building, Marcus himself checking the building directory, and a final shot of him testing her apartment door handle. Theron stared at the images in the darkness of his penthouse, his expression cold enough to frost glass. What his team discovered in the surveillance footage made his blood run cold. She had 48 hours, maybe less. Monday morning, the conference room on the 40th floor of the Cade Industries building assembled 6 people around an obsidian table. The space never appeared on any official floor plan, accessed only by private elevator with biometric security. It existed in the liminal space between Theron's legitimate empire and the shadow operations that actually sustained it. Dahlia Voss occupied the seat to his right, 42 years old, former federal prosecutor who discovered that justice worked faster outside the courtroom. Her silver-streaked black hair was pulled into a severe bun that matched her expression as she reviewed the files spread before her. Marcus Lyle, she said, her voice carrying crisp efficiency. 34, Stanford graduate, currently managing partner at Nexus Tech Solutions, clean record, respectable credit, belongs to the right clubs, donates to acceptable charities. She looked up, her green eyes sharp. On paper, he's exactly the person who gets away with this. Theron sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled in front of him. What did Bryony tell you this morning? Everything? Dahlia pulled up a tablet, scrolling through notes. The relationship lasted 4 months, ended when she discovered he was still involved with his ex-girlfriend. The recordings were made throughout their relationship. Bedroom, bathroom, even one from what appears to be a hidden camera in her own apartment that he installed during an overnight stay. The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Around the table, the others shifted slightly, their expressions hardening. Whatever moral flexibility Theron's organization required, there were still lines. Violation of intimate privacy crossed several of them. The encryption? Theron asked. Sophisticated, answered Dmitry Kask, the team's digital specialist. At 28, He looked more like a graduate student than someone who could dismantle corporate security systems before breakfast. He's using military-grade encryption with a dead man's switch. If he doesn't check in every 72 hours, the files auto-release to a predetermined list of contacts. Email, social media, direct messaging, everything deploys simultaneously. Can you break it? Given enough time, probably, Dmitri admitted. But time is what we don't have. He's expecting payment by Sunday at noon. That's... He checked his watch. 49 hours from now. Even if I could crack the encryption, I'd need to be certain I'd found every copy, every backup, and every redundancy he's created. Miss one, and it all releases anyway. Theron absorbed this with visible frustration. So we can't just destroy the material. Not reliably, Dahlia confirmed, which means we need to neutralize the threat by removing his motivation to release it. Or his ability to execute the release, added Camden Price, head of physical operations. At 53, Camden carried himself with the quiet competence of someone who'd spent 20 years in military special operations before discovering that private sector work paid better and asked fewer ethical questions. Dead man switches require someone alive to maintain them. We interrupt that maintenance. The switch stays dormant. Theron's expression darkened. We're not killing him. That's off the table. Didn't suggest killing. Camden replied smoothly. But there are other ways to interrupt someone's ability to maintain their digital presence. Incapacitation, relocation, strategic hospitalization. Lots of options that don't involve permanent solutions. Dahlia leaned forward, her prosecutor's mind already assembling the case. Here's what we know. Marcus checks his phone obsessively, every 2 to 3 hours according to his patterns. The dead man's switch requires manual reset. He's paranoid enough to have backup plans, but arrogant enough to believe his primary system is untouchable. Which means we need a layered approach, Theron said, his strategic mind engaging fully. Multiple pressure points activated simultaneously so he can't pivot to backup plans. The next hour dissolved into detailed planning that resembled military operations more than criminal enterprise. Camden outlined physical surveillance and intervention options. Dmitri mapped Marcus's digital footprint and identified vulnerability points. Dahlia constructed the legal framework that would provide cover if anything went publicly wrong. By the time Portland's skyline began showing hints of dawn, they had a plan. Not a perfect plan. Those didn't exist outside fiction, but a comprehensive one that addressed multiple contingencies. The timeline is aggressive, Dahlia warned. We're executing tomorrow evening. Any one of these components fails, and Marcus gets spooked. A spooked extortionist with a dead man's switch is the worst possible outcome. Then we don't fail, Theron said simply. Bryony Ashford came to me because the legal system couldn't help her fast enough. We're going to prove that some problems require different solutions. Camden closed his tactical folder with decisive finality. When do we move? Theron checked his watch. Marcus plays racquetball every Tuesday at 6 p.m. at the Northwest Athletic Club. That gives us... He calculated quickly. 36 hours to finalize positions. The team dispersed with the efficiency of people who'd executed similar operations before. Only Dahlia remained, gathering her materials with methodical precision. At the door, she paused. This girl must be special, she observed. You don't usually involve yourself personally in protection details. Theron was quiet for a moment, staring out at Portland's awakening skyline. She reminded me of someone, he said finally. Someone I used to be, before I learned to stop being vulnerable. Dahlia nodded, understanding requiring no further explanation. Let's hope our plan works then, because if Marcus senses what's coming... The plan was perfect, but plans only worked if the monster followed the script. And this monster was unpredictable. Tuesday evening, the Northwest Athletic Club occupied 3 floors of converted warehouse space in Portland's Pearl District, where young professionals paid premium prices to maintain bodies they abused with long hours and expensive addictions. Marcus Lyle arrived at 5:43, 17 minutes early as his pattern suggested he would. Camden's team watched from 3 positions: the parking garage, the lobby cafe, and the equipment room adjacent to the racquetball courts. Target entering. Through main entrance, came the whispered update through Theron's earpiece. He sat in a black SUV 2 blocks away, monitoring 6 different camera feeds on a tablet, while Dimitri worked frantically beside him on a laptop covered in code that scrolled past faster than human reading speed. "How's the access coming?" Theron asked without taking his eyes off the screens, showing Marcus checking in at the front desk, his racquetball bag slung over one shoulder, his expression carrying the particular smugness of someone who believed themselves 3 moves ahead of everyone else. "His phone's security is military grade," Dimitri muttered, fingers flying across keys. "But his cloud backup authentication is embarrassingly weak. I'm in the secondary storage now, cataloging file locations. Give me 8 more minutes." They didn't have 8 minutes. Marcus's racquetball partner, a corporate lawyer named Jeffrey something, had just arrived. The game would start in less than 5 minutes, and once they were in that court, the glass walls and enclosed space would limit Camden's options significantly. "Camden, you're green for approach," Theron said into his mic. "Dimitri needs time. Keep Marcus occupied, but don't spook him." "Copy that." Camden's voice came back, professional and unhurried. On the tablet screen, Theron watched Camden emerge from the equipment room wearing athletic clothes that made him look like any other member. He intercepted Marcus at the court entrance with an easy smile that suggested coincidence rather than planning. The conversation appeared casual from a distance, Camden gesturing toward the court, Marcus shaking his head, then Camden pulling out his phone to show something that made Marcus lean in with interest. Whatever Camden was selling, Marcus was buying. 6 minutes, Dimitri announced. "I've located the primary cache, confirming redundancy locations now." Theron's jaw tightened. In the surveillance feed, Marcus's racquetball partner had entered the frame, looking confused about the delay. Camden was still talking, but Marcus's body language had shifted, shoulders pulling back, expression closing off, the universal signals of someone preparing to disengage from an unwanted conversation. "He's losing interest," Theron observed, tension creeping into his voice. "Camden, whatever you're doing." The warning came too late. Marcus stepped around Camden with the dismissive efficiency of someone accustomed to ending conversations on his terms. He entered the racquetball court, the door sealing behind him with hydraulic finality. Through the glass walls, Theron could see him dropping his bag, pulling out his racket, his phone still very much in his possession and fully functional. "Problem," Dimitri said, his voice carrying an edge of panic unusual for someone usually unflappable. "I found another encryption layer. He's got a secondary dead man switch I didn't know about, this one tied to his fitness tracker, not just his phone. If his heart rate drops below 40 beats per minute or spikes above 180 for more than 30 seconds, it triggers an emergency release protocol." "You're telling me this now?" Theron's controlled demeanor cracked slightly, genuine alarm breaking through. "I'm telling you as soon as I've found it," Dimitri shot back. "He's paranoid in ways I've never seen. This isn't just about protecting blackmail material. This guy's planned for active threat scenarios." In the surveillance feed, Marcus had begun warming up, hitting the ball against the court wall with increasing intensity. His fitness tracker, a sleek band around his left wrist, flashed with each heartbeat spike as exercise elevated his pulse. Theron's mind raced through contingencies, adjusting the plan in real time. Can you disable the fitness tracker remotely? Not immediately. These things alert you if they lose connection or detect tampering. Dimitri's hands never stopped moving across his keyboard. I need 4 more minutes to map all the dead man's switches and prepare simultaneous intervention. But if we move on him physically before I'm ready... The heart rate spike triggers everything, Theron finished grimly. So we can't touch him, can't scare him, can't do anything that might elevate his pulse significantly. Not until I've disarmed every trigger simultaneously, Dimitri confirmed. Through the glass walls of the racquetball court, Marcus was playing now, his movements aggressive and competitive. The ball ricocheted off walls with sharp cracks that the microphones picked up as staccato percussion. His heart rate, visible on Theron's tablet through Dimitri's hack, hovered around 135, elevated from exercise but nowhere near dangerous thresholds. 3 minutes, Dimitri said. I'm staging the disarm protocols now. Once I execute, we'll have maybe a 10-second window before his systems detect the intrusion, and failsafe to auto-release anyway. Theron watched Marcus play, watched him laugh at something his partner said, watched him check his phone during the break between games. 36 hours of planning, thousands of dollars in resources, 6 people's coordinated effort, all of it balanced on a knife's edge that could tip either direction based on variables they'd only just discovered. Boss! Camden's voice came through urgent and tight. We have a bigger problem. On the surveillance feed, a woman had just entered the club. Mid-30s, blonde, expensive athletic wear. She moved through the lobby with purpose, heading directly toward the racquetball courts. Who is that? Theron demanded. Dimitri pulled up facial recognition, his face going pale. Melissa Torrance, Marcus's ex-girlfriend, the one Bryony discovered he was still involved with. He pulled up social media profiles, recent messages, his expression darkening with each revelation. She's been in contact with Marcus constantly, according to their message history. He stopped, swallowing hard. She knows about Bryony. She knows about the blackmail. And based on this conversation from 40 minutes ago, she's here to warn Marcus that something feels wrong. Through the glass walls, Melissa had reached the racquetball court. She knocked, gesturing urgently. Marcus stopped mid-game, his expression shifting from annoyed to alert as he read her body language. His phone buzzed. 3 words appeared in text notification visible on Theron's hacked feed. They're on to you. Marcus's heart rate spiked, 140, 150, 165 as adrenaline dumped into his system. His hand went to his phone, fingers moving toward the app that would manually trigger everything if he felt threatened enough. They were out of time. Execute now! Theron's command cut through the channel with surgical precision. Dimitri's fingers became a blur across his keyboard, hitting the enter key with finality. On his screen, 6 different programs launched simultaneously, each targeting a different component of Marcus's digital infrastructure. Cloud backups corrupted with precision. Authentication tokens invalidated. Dead man's switches flooded with false positive signals that made them think they were already triggered, causing them to abort secondary protocols. In the racquetball court, Marcus's phone screen flickered once, twice, then went dark. His fitness tracker vibrated with error messages. The tablet in his bag, backup system they'd only discovered 90 seconds ago, began a forced factory reset that would wipe everything before he could stop it. Marcus stared at his dead phone with confusion that rapidly transformed into understanding, then panic. His heart rate spiked higher, 170, 175. But Dimitri's intervention had already severed the connection between his biometrics and the trigger systems. The switches were receiving static now, White noise that looked like normal operation while actual control had been completely stripped away. Got it. Dmitri breathed, his entire body sagging with relief. All primary and backup systems neutralized. He's got nothing left except the local copies on his devices, and those are... His screen flashed with confirmation. Currently being encrypted with keys only I control. He's locked out of his own blackmail material. Through the glass walls, Marcus had pulled out his phone, frantically pressing buttons that no longer responded. Melissa stood beside him, her own phone out, both of them clearly trying to understand what had just happened to their constructed leverage. "Camden, you're clear for approach," Theron said, his voice steady again now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Keep it public, keep it clean. I just want him to understand his situation." Camden moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd delivered bad news to dangerous people before. He entered the racquetball court despite Jeffrey's protests, his presence immediately commanding attention. The conversation was brief, Camden speaking in low tones while Marcus's face cycled through denial, anger, and finally a pale understanding that his world had just inverted. When Camden walked away 3 minutes later, Marcus remained frozen in place, his dead phone clutched in his hand, like a religious artifact that had suddenly stopped performing miracles. Bryony's phone rang at 7:43 that evening. She'd been sitting in Theron's corporate apartment since leaving the restaurant 2 nights ago, watching Portland's lights spread across the hills while anxiety made sleep impossible. The unknown number made her heart rate spike, but she answered anyway. "It's done." Theron's voice came through, carrying exhaustion that made him sound more human than she'd heard before. "Marcus Lyle no longer has access to any of the material he was using against you. Every copy, every backup, every dead man's switch. All of it neutralized or encrypted beyond his reach." Bryony's breath caught. "You're certain?" "My people are very good at being certain," Theron replied. "Marcus and his girlfriend are currently discovering that every attempt to access or distribute the files fails. By midnight tonight, they'll understand that continuing to threaten you only makes their own situation more complicated." "What happens to them?" "That depends on their choices," Theron said. "They can walk away quietly, or they can escalate and discover that blackmail works both directions. I've had my team compile interesting documentation about Marcus's business practices and Melissa's involvement in previous extortion schemes. They're both smart enough to recognize mutually assured destruction when it's presented clearly." Bryony closed her eyes, feeling tears she'd been suppressing for 8 months finally break through. "Thank you," she managed, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to—" "You don't need to thank me," Theron interrupted gently. "You just need to go home and start rebuilding your life without this weight. Your apartment is secure. My people swept it and removed the camera Marcus installed. You're safe now." The word safe felt foreign, like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "The envelope you gave me, the photograph of you at 16. Why did you really show me that?" Theron was quiet for a long moment. "Because I wanted you to understand that helping you wasn't charity or transaction. It was closing a circle that started decades ago, when I was the one trapped by someone else's cruelty. No one came for me then. But I can come for others now. That has to mean something." Bryony understood then what she'd suspected during their first conversation, that Theroncade's empire, for all its darkness and moral ambiguity, operated according to rules that included protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. He was dangerous, yes, but danger aimed at predators became a different thing entirely. "What happens now?" she asked. "Between us, I mean." "That's your choice," Theron said. "You can walk away completely. Return to your life as if this never happened. Or, he paused, choosing words with care. You can stay in contact. No obligations, no debts. Just two people who understand survival, who might benefit from knowing they're not alone in remembering what it costs. Before Bryony could answer, a sound made her blood freeze. Her apartment door handle turning, slowly, testing whether it was locked. She opened her apartment door to find it empty. But the note on the counter made her hands shake. This isn't finished. The note had been there when Theron's security team swept the apartment. They'd deliberately left it in place, a controlled test to see if Marcus would be stupid enough to physically visit after losing his digital leverage. Cameras Bryony couldn't see had recorded Marcus entering using a key she'd forgotten he still possessed, placing the note with shaking hands, and leaving 6 minutes later. He's desperate, Dahlia explained over breakfast the next morning at a cafe Bryony had never visited before, another security precaution. Men like Marcus don't handle losing control gracefully. The note is psychological warfare, an attempt to make you afraid, even though he has no actual power left. Bryony stirred her coffee without drinking it. So what do? We demonstrate that threats work both directions. Dahlia slid a thin folder across the table. Marcus received this via courier this morning. Inside is documentation of every illegal business practice his company has engaged in for the past 3 years. Tax evasion, securities fraud, misappropriation of investor funds. Also included is evidence of Melissa's involvement in 2 previous extortion schemes before she met Marcus. You found all that in 2 days? We found it months ago, Dahlia corrected. Theron maintains files on anyone who operates in his spheres of influence. The information existed. We just hadn't needed to deploy it until now. She leaned back, her expression softening slightly. Marcus called his lawyer an hour after receiving the folder. By this afternoon, you'll receive a formal letter stating that any and all materials related to your relationship have been permanently deleted, and that he will have no further contact with you under any circumstances. And if he's lying? If he kept copies? Then he goes to prison for 5 to 7 years while his startup collapses, and his investors sue him into bankruptcy, Dahlia said simply. The choice is very clear. Walk away now, or lose everything he's built. Marcus is arrogant, but he's not completely stupid. The formal letter arrived at 4:33 that afternoon, exactly as Dahlia had predicted. Bryony read it 3 times, searching for hidden threats or conditions, finding only legal language that confirmed what Dahlia had promised. Marcus was gone. The nightmare was over. Except it didn't feel over. It felt like waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the universe to correct this unexpected mercy with fresh catastrophe. The weeks that followed felt surreal, like living in someone else's life. Bryony returned to work at Ashwood and Crow, where the staff whispered about her bold approach to Table 7 but never asked direct questions. Theron continued his Thursday evening routine, occupying his corner booth with the same controlled presence, but now when Bryony passed his table, his expression changed. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement that they shared something the rest of the room couldn't see. Small improvements began appearing in her life with the subtlety of skilled intervention. The landlord suddenly discovered an accounting error that meant she'd been overcharged for 8 months. Here was a refund check that covered next month's rent and security deposit on a better apartment if she wanted to relocate. Her car, which had been making concerning noises for months, was repaired while she worked a double shift, the mechanic explaining that a regular customer had prepaid the service as part of some community goodwill program. Her student loan servicer contacted her about a grant program for philosophy graduates working in hospitality. Rare, specific, and generous enough to cut her monthly payments by 70%. The electric company enrolled her in an assistance program she'd never heard of. Her health insurance, Previously bare-bones catastrophic coverage was upgraded to premium tier through her employer's sudden policy change. Each improvement arrived with plausible explanation, official documentation, nothing that screamed, "Dangerous man is systematically removing obstacles from your life." But Bryony recognized the pattern. Theron was doing for her what the law couldn't, creating stability through resources and connections that existed outside conventional channels. She thought about calling the number on his card, about confronting him directly about the help she hadn't asked for. But hesitation stopped her. Maybe gratitude? Maybe recognition that acknowledging the gifts would create obligation neither of them wanted. So instead, she accepted each improvement silently, filing them away as evidence that Theron Cade's protection extended beyond the immediate crisis into something more sustainable. 2 months after their first conversation, Bryony discovered that someone had been systematically paying off her credit card debt, not in suspicious lump sums that would trigger investigation, but in small monthly payments that looked like they came from her own account through automatic billing. The debt that had been suffocating her for 3 years disappeared incrementally, like snow melting in spring. She should have been grateful. She was grateful. But she was also beginning to understand that Theron's help came with invisible strings, not debts in the traditional sense, but connections that bound them together in ways she couldn't fully understand yet. The black car had been following her for 3 days. Was she being protected? Or hunted? The black sedan was a Mercedes S-Class with tinted windows that reflected Portland's gray skies without revealing anything inside. It appeared behind her when she left work, maintained 2-car distance during her commute, and parked across from her building with engine idling. 3 days of consistent presence that could mean protection or threat, and Bryony's fraying nerves couldn't distinguish between them anymore. On the 4th day, she changed her pattern deliberately. Instead of going straight home, she walked into Powell's books. 3 floors of labyrinthine shelves, where following someone required proximity that would make surveillance obvious. She wound through philosophy, literature, and science fiction, before doubling back to the cafe on the 2nd floor. The black sedan's driver was already there, sitting at a corner table with coffee and a newspaper that he clearly wasn't reading. Mid-40s, built like someone who spent serious time in the gym, wearing a suit that suggested professional security rather than criminal intent. When Bryony approached his table directly, he looked up without surprise. "Are you following me on Theron Cade's orders?" she asked, loud enough that nearby readers glanced up with interest. The man folded his newspaper with precise movements. "I'm ensuring your continued safety, Miss Ashford." Which is what Mr. Cade requested when Marcus Lyle's known associate started asking questions about you last week. The floor seemed to tilt slightly. What associates? His business partner noticed the sudden change in Marcus's behavior, the paranoia, the restricted communication, the way he flinches when certain topics arise. He started investigating what might have caused such dramatic shifts. The driver's expression remained professionally neutral. 2 days ago, that partner hired a private investigator to look into you. We've been monitoring the situation to ensure it doesn't escalate. Bryony sat down uninvited, her legs suddenly unreliable. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because there was nothing to tell yet. The investigation is preliminary, mostly reviewing public records and social media. Nothing threatening, just information gathering. He paused, choosing words with precision. But Mr. Cade believes in preventive measures. Better to maintain visible protection that discourages escalation than to wait for actual threats to materialize. So that's what this is? The car, the presence, all of it? Just deterrent? Deterrent and documentation. If anyone moves against you, we have complete records of their behavior beforehand. Makes prosecution significantly easier. He pulled out a business card, his own this time, not Theron's. My name is Roland. I'll be primary on your security detail for the foreseeable future. You won't always see me, but I'm always watching. Any concerns? Any suspicious activity? You call this number immediately. Bryony took the card, her mind reeling through implications. How long is foreseeable future? That's between you and Mr. Cade, Roland said. But in my experience, once he decides someone's under his protection, it doesn't have an expiration date unless they explicitly request release from it. The word protection felt heavier than gratitude could support. She'd come to Theron for help with an immediate crisis, and he'd responded by essentially adopting her into his sphere of influence. Every improved circumstance, every paid debt, every watchful eye, all of it wove her deeper into a web she didn't know how to navigate. I need to talk to him, Bryony said. Not through intermediaries or business cards. Actually talk. Roland nodded as if he'd expected this. He'll be at Ashwood and Crow tomorrow night, 9:30, table 7. He stood, leaving money for his untouched coffee. For what it's worth, Miss Ashford, I've worked for Mr. Cade for 8 years. The people under his protection are genuinely safe. He doesn't help people to control them. He helps them because control was used against him, and he remembers what that cost. After Roland left, Bryony sat in the bookstore cafe for another hour, watching Powell's customers browse and read and exist in normal lives, uncomplicated by mafia protection and surveillance details. She'd asked Theron to make Marcus disappear, and he'd succeeded beyond her expectations. But in solving that problem, he'd created a new reality where her safety depended on a dangerous man's continued goodwill. The question was whether that reality felt more like prison or sanctuary, and whether the answer mattered if it was the only option she had. Tomorrow night, table 7. Time to understand what she'd actually agreed to when she'd sat down beside Portland's most dangerous man. The invitation arrived in a blood-red envelope. Tomorrow night. Come alone. No choice but to face him. Ashwood and Crow on Friday night carried a different energy than Thursday's controlled elegance. The weekend crowd skewed younger, louder, more willing to drink expensive cocktails and laugh without checking volume. But Table 7 maintained its isolated atmosphere, a pocket of controlled silence in the surrounding noise. Theron was already there when Bryony arrived at 9:28, 2 minutes early for an appointment that hadn't been formally scheduled, but both of them knew would happen. He wore charcoal gray tonight instead of black, a subtle softening that matched the way he gestured to the seat across from him. Not beside him this time, but facing him directly where they could see each other clearly. You wanted to talk? He said simply, no preamble or small talk. Bryony sat, aware of other diners pretending not to watch. I want to understand what I've become to you. Asset? Responsibility? Some project you took on because I reminded you of your younger self? She kept her voice, level, refusing to let frustration sharpen into accusation. You've systematically improved my life in ways I'm grateful for, but gratitude is starting to feel like a chain I didn't agree to wear. Theron absorbed this with no visible reaction, though an expression flickered behind his eyes. What prompted this particular crisis of conscience? I met Roland, your security detail who's been following me for days. I came to you for help with a specific problem. You solved that problem beautifully, but everything since then, the debt payments, the job protections, the surveillance, that wasn't part of our original transaction. You're right, Theron agreed, surprising her. It wasn't part of what you asked for. It's part of what I decided you needed, which isn't the same thing at all. He paused, his fingers drumming once against the table in that gesture she'd learned meant he was choosing words with precision. After you left here that first night, I had my people compile a complete file on your life. I saw the patterns, the debt accumulated from your mother's medical bills, The job insecurity from employers who exploit hospitality workers. The systemic vulnerability that made you easy prey for someone like Marcus. So you decided to fix all of it? Without asking? Yes. No apology in his tone, just acknowledgement. Because asking would have given you the opportunity to refuse help you needed. And because people who've been victimized once often can't see the structures that make them vulnerable to victimization again. The honesty of it, the absolute absence of pretense, took some wind from Bryony's anger. You could have just explained what you were doing. And you would have said no, Theron replied. Would have insisted you could handle everything yourself, that you didn't need ongoing help, that accepting more than the bare minimum would create debt you couldn't repay. He held her gaze. Am I wrong? He wasn't. Bryony recognized the truth of it immediately, that if Theron had approached her with an itemized list of interventions, she would have accepted only the Marcus situation and refused everything else. Pride, independence, the deep-seated belief that accepting help meant owing something she couldn't afford to pay. So instead, you just took over my life? I removed obstacles from your life, Theron corrected. There's a difference. You still make every choice about your education, your work, where you live, who you see. I've simply ensured that those choices aren't constrained by artificial scarcity created by systems designed to keep people like you trapped. Bryony wanted to argue, but the distinction he was making actually mattered. He hadn't controlled her decisions. He'd expanded her options. The security detail didn't restrict her movement. It protected her ability to move freely. The debt payments didn't create obligation. They removed financial chains that had been limiting her choices for years. Why me? She asked finally. You said I reminded you of yourself. But Portland is full of people trapped by circumstances. What made me special enough for this level of intervention? Theron was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. You sat beside me and asked directly for help when every survival instinct should have told you to run. That courage is rare, especially in people who've been hurt badly enough to know better. He refocused on her face. I've spent 27 years building power and influence. Most of that building required becoming someone people feared. You looked at me and saw someone who might be capable of protection instead. That matters more than you realize, because it means you're not just the monster everyone thinks you are. Because it means someone sees a difference, Theron corrected quietly. And when you've spent decades being the thing people warn their children about, having someone recognize that you can be more than that single story, it's worth protecting. The raw vulnerability in his admission settled between them like something physical. This wasn't just about helping someone in need. It was about Theron's own need to be seen as more than the sum of his reputation. Bryony reached across the table, not touching him, but placing her hand close enough that the gesture registered. I'm not afraid of you, she said. I was never afraid of you, even that first night. But I need to know, what am I to you really? Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like I'm becoming important in ways neither of us planned for. Theron looked at her hand near his, at the deliberate distance and the implied possibility. There's one more thing you need to know, he said finally. The real reason I helped you. He pulled a folder from beside him on the booth seat. Not an envelope this time, but a proper legal folder with clasp and official appearance. He slid it across the table, his expression unreadable. The real reason I helped you. Bryony opened the folder with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of importance the moment carried. Inside she found photographs, not of Theron this time, but of herself. Images from various points in her life, high school graduation, college campus candidates, working at her previous jobs, walking through Portland streets on ordinary days. "I don't understand," she said, looking up at him with confusion. 6 years ago, Theron began, his voice carrying a roughness that suggested this story cost him something to tell. "I was at Portland State for a legitimate business meeting. Afterward, I walked through campus because I sometimes do that, remind myself of the education I never got to finish. There was a protest happening, students demonstrating about university labor practices, demanding better wages for campus workers." He gestured to one of the photos, Bryony at 23, standing on a makeshift stage with a megaphone, her face animated with passionate conviction. "You were speaking about your mother," Theron continued, "about how she'd worked in the university cafeteria for 15 years, how she'd gotten sick because she couldn't afford the health insurance the university refused to provide part-time workers, how the system was designed to extract labor while avoiding responsibility." He paused. "You were angry and articulate and completely unafraid of consequences. Campus security was moving toward the protest to shut it down, but you kept speaking until they physically removed you from that stage." Bryony remembered that day, the way her voice had cracked from shouting, the way campus police had gripped her arms hard enough to bruise, the way she'd been suspended for a week and nearly expelled for disrupting university operations. "I watched you get dragged away," Theron said quietly, still trying to speak, still fighting to make people hear you. "And I thought about all the times I'd wanted someone to fight for me like that when I was young and trapped. All the times I'd needed someone to be angry on my behalf about injustice that adults had decided was just the way things were." He reached across the table then, actually touching her hand for the first time. Brief contact that carried more weight than longer gestures might have. "That's when I started keeping track of you. Not surveillance, not invasion, just awareness. I knew when your mother died 6 months later. I knew when you had to drop out for a semester to work full-time. I knew when Marcus Lyle entered your life, and I knew when he started weaponizing your trust." His jaw tightened. "I also knew I had no legitimate reason to intervene in any of it. You were a stranger who'd once impressed me with your courage. That didn't give me rights to your life or your choices. Until I walked into your restaurant and sat down beside you," Bryony finished, understanding crystallizing. "I gave you the reason you'd been waiting for." "You gave me permission," Theron corrected. "There's a difference. I wanted to help you years ago, but help needs consent. When you sat down that night, you chose to ask. That changed everything." Bryony looked at the photos again. Evidence of 6 years of distant observation, of Theron carrying awareness of her existence through his own complicated life. It should have felt invasive, like stalking dressed up as concern. Instead, it felt like being seen in ways she'd never experienced before, like mattering to someone powerful enough to actually make a difference. "So what now?" she asked. "You've solved my problems, protected me from threats, and improved my circumstances beyond what I could have managed alone. Where does that leave us?" Theron was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing the rim of his Scotch glass. "That's your choice. You can take everything I've given you and walk away. Build your life on your own. I'll maintain security protocols because that's non-negotiable, but from enough distance that you'd never notice unless you looked for it. Or you stay," he said simply. "Not because you owe me, not out of gratitude or obligation, but because two people who understand survival sometimes build something stronger than friendship and more complex than romance. A partnership based on mutual recognition that we're both more than our worst moments and our greatest fears." The proposition hung between them, weighted with possibility. Bryony thought about the past 3 months, how Theron's intervention had given her back choices that poverty and fear had stolen. how his protection had created space for her to breathe, how knowing someone that powerful considered her worth defending had changed her understanding of her own value. "I want to stay," she said, surprised by how certain she felt. "But on one condition. Name it. You stop making decisions about my life without asking first. The security detail, the financial interventions, all of it. I want to be consulted. Not to refuse help, but to have agency in accepting it." She held his gaze firmly. "I won't trade Marcus's control for yours, even if your version is gentler and better intentioned." An expression crossed Theron's face. Respect, maybe, or recognition that she'd understood the actual danger in their dynamic and addressed it directly. "Agreed," he said. "From now on, you're informed of any intervention before it happens. Your consent becomes prerequisite to my action." He extended his hand across the table formally, offering a handshake to seal the agreement. Bryony took it, feeling the strength in his grip and the control that prevented it from becoming crushing. The gesture felt like treaty negotiation between equals rather than powerful man offering charity to grateful recipient. "Welcome to the complexity," Theron said with what almost resembled a genuine smile. "Being in my life isn't simple or safe, but it's honest, and it's yours for as long as you want it." 3 months later, Bryony stood on the balcony of an apartment she'd chosen herself. Nicer than she could have afforded alone, but one where she paid actual rent through her actual salary from a promotion at Ashwood and Crow that had been genuinely earned through her work. The Portland skyline spread before her, lights reflecting off the Willamette River in patterns that never quite repeated. Behind her, inside the apartment, Theron reviewed paperwork for his legitimate businesses, while Dahlia talked through strategy for a legal case that would actually see courtroom arguments rather than shadow interventions. Roland had called 30 minutes ago with security updates. No threats, no concerns, just routine check-in that she'd requested be kept brief, unless actually necessary. Her life had transformed, but not into a fairy tale. She still worked full-time, still paid her own bills, and still made her own choices about education and career and daily existence. The difference was that those choices existed in a framework of safety she'd never experienced before. Theron's protection removed external threats without replacing them with internal control. They'd settled into something that defied simple categorization. Not quite romance, though attraction existed in the spaces between their conversations. Not quite friendship, though trust had developed through sustained honesty. Not mentor-protégé, though he guided her through understanding power structures she'd never navigated before. Partnership, maybe? Alliance between two people who'd both been hurt badly enough to recognize strength in others who'd survived similar wounds. Theron joined her on the balcony, bringing coffee that he'd learned she preferred with too much cream and not enough brewing time. The gesture was small, domestic, utterly at odds with his reputation as Portland's most dangerous man. "You're thinking loudly," he observed, leaning against the railing beside her. "I'm thinking about that first night," Bryony admitted. "About sitting down beside you without knowing whether you'd help me or hurt me. Whether I'd made the stupidest decision of my life or the bravest. And now that you know?" She considered the question seriously, watching city lights paint patterns across dark water. "Both," she decided. It was stupid to approach someone that dangerous without any guarantee of safety. But it was brave to trust that danger could be redirected toward protection. She turned to face him directly. "You scared away my monsters, Theron. But more than that, you showed me I didn't have to hide from them alone anymore." His expression softened in ways it never did in public spaces, the mask lowering enough to show the man beneath the reputation. "You sat beside me when no one else would," he said quietly. You looked at everything I was and decided I might be capable of more. That changed something fundamental about how I see myself. The admission cost him, she could tell. Men like Theron didn't offer vulnerability casually, but she'd earned it through the same courage that had made her approach his table 3 months ago, the willingness to see beyond surface presentation to the complicated human beneath. Below them, Portland continued its Friday night rhythm. People moved through streets without knowing that the woman on this balcony had once been desperate enough to gamble everything on a stranger's mercy. Without knowing that the man beside her commanded an empire built on fear, but used it occasionally for protection instead of predation. No one dared sit beside Theron Cade. But Bryony Ashford had, and in doing so, had changed both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. She'd come seeking rescue from immediate crisis and found instead something more sustainable. A partnership built on mutual recognition that survival was easier when you weren't alone, and that monsters sometimes fought each other so the vulnerable could finally rest. "Thank you," she said simply, the words encompassing 3 months of transformation she hadn't known how to ask for. Theron's hand found hers on the railing, his grip warm and steady. "Thank you," he replied, "for giving me a reason to be more than what everyone expects me to be." The Portland night wrapped around them, cold and beautiful and full of possibility. Somewhere in the city, other people were trapped by circumstances they couldn't escape alone. Other predators were weaponizing trust against the vulnerable. Other desperate people were calculating impossible odds and wondering whether to risk everything on unlikely rescue. Bryony hoped some of them would find the courage to sit down beside their own dangerous strangers. Hope they'd discover what she had, that sometimes the scariest person in the room was also the one most capable of fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The universe had taken her worst moment and transformed it into something that looked surprisingly like hope. And standing on this balcony with Theron beside her, watching Portland's lights reflect off dark water like scattered stars, Bryony understood that redemption came in unexpected forms. Sometimes it looked like a mafia boss who remembered being vulnerable. Sometimes it looked like a waitress brave enough to demand help from danger itself. And sometimes it looked exactly like this. Two people who'd both survived monsters, choosing to build something gentler from the wreckage of their separate pasts.